Today's theme with our featured guest, Joanna Eleftheriou, is Border Ache, σύνορο πονά. Today marks the anniversary of Greece's refusal to surrender to Mussolini's fascist regime in 1940 and the events leading to Greece's entry into the Second World War. Given events and movements taking place throughout the world at the moment, this is a particularly timely remembrance of defiance and refusal of oppression and domination. Themes that emerge, albeit in a different context, in my friend Joanna's wonderful and delightfully atypical memoir, This Way Back. Her book is filled with tensions and paradoxes, as well as discoveries of all sorts, some joyful and celebratory, and others painful, but ultimately all enlivening. Author Sonia Huber writes, Joanna Eleftheriou's collection This Way Back offers a series of essays that both stand alone and form a larger narrative about immigration, bicultural identity, sexual orientation, and the pull of a landscape. These lovely and moving essays are nostalgic, complex, and thoughtful, with sentences you will underline and return to, and that will sear you with their beauty. And the back cover of This Way Back describes the book far better than I possibly could. It reads, going back to her ancestral homeland, a Greek-American girl discovers she is a lesbian in love with God, so her questions about home and belonging will not be easily answered. This Way Back dramatizes a childhood split between Queens, New York, and Cyprus, an island nation with a long colonial history and a culture to which Joanna Eleftheriou could never quite adjust. The book avows a Greek Cypriot American lesbian's existence by documenting its scenes, reenacting an 1829 mass suicide by jumping off a school stage onto gym mats at St. Nicholas, harvesting carobs on ancestral land, purchasing UNESCO-protected lace, marching in the island's first gay pride parade, visiting Cyprus's occupied north against a dying father's wish, and pruning geraniums, cypress trees, and jasmine after her father grew too weak to lift the shears. While the author's life binds the essays in This Way Back into what reads like a memoir, the book questions memoir's conventional boundaries between the individual and her community, and between political and personal loss, the human and the environment, and the living and the dead. In her writing, Joanna ponders, along with Manolis Rasoulis, the notion that each of us aches over a border. Καθένας είναι ένας που σύνορο πονά. She writes about the wound of the border between occupied and free Cyprus, as well as the border between homeland and diaspora. Joanna grew up in New York and Cyprus, studied at Cornell University and the University of Birmingham Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek Studies. She earned a PhD in English from the University of Missouri and now lives in Virginia, where she's an assistant professor of English at Christopher Newport University. She's also a contributing editor at Assay, a journal of nonfiction studies, serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Modern Greek Studies, and teaches at writing workshops in Greece on the island of Thasos. A warm welcome to Joanna Eleftheriou. Joanna, καλώς όρισες.
Thank you, Peter. Joanna, Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Thank you so much. Ευχαριστώ που ήρθατε. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. It's such an honor to be here and to read from my work. Thank you especially to Vassiliki and Peter. I'm going to read a part of This Way Back. The title comes from a sign in Limassol that says Πορεία επαναστροφής. And I didn't know what it meant. I actually thought it was a political message saying, pointing north, way back to the occupied territory. And then a friend of mine told me it's actually just a sign saying that's the best way back to the center of Limassol. And she thought that this meant, because I misunderstood the sign, the meaning of This Way Back, that it's not possible to use it as the title of my book. And I said, no, this makes it even more appropriate, because I think that a misunderstanding and a mistranslation and an assumption that the context in Cyprus of everything is always the invasion actually captures something both about living in Cyprus and about living in diaspora and in a second language, because I think everyone who lives in their second language and is comfortable in their second language finds themselves making assumptions about what things mean and realizing that you haven't quite grasped some of the context or the meaning. I didn't understand that epistrophy and epanastrophy, how different they actually are, that epanastrophy is a U-turn. I didn't learn that. So that's kind of the context of the title of the book. And I'm going to read for about 8 to 10 minutes from the book, and hope that you'll write down some questions for me as you're listening. And the questions can be either in Greek or English. There's an epigraph from Konstantinos Kavafis. Wise as you've become and full of experience, you will have understood what Ithacas mean. I was born with nostalgia in my blood. Immigrants of all parts of the world tell stories of their old country's perfection, but diaspora Greeks hold on to their homeland with a special tenacity. You can't live in Greece very long without hearing the songs of bitter bread and hard, cold beds, to pikro ψωμί της ξενιτιάς, which means exile, being far away from Greece. When I had learned enough Greek to understand these songs, I wondered at the pleasure Greeks seemed to take in singing about exile's pain. Like the bite of retsina in their wine, like the moan of bagpipes in their music, longing for an Ithaca from the distance of Kirkis Island still moves the Greeks to sing. And while Odysseus, archetype and father of all homeward wanderers, finally got home and stayed, most Greek emigres take up residence abroad, make xenitia and distance from Ithaca their fate. For Greece is poor, its soils are barren, and its industry unable to turn a profit. Like Odysseus, many Greeks living abroad today still talk about their homeland like it was Ithaca, a land our mothers used to sing of as they woke us in the morning, and of which our fathers told heroic stories as they lulled us back to sleep at night. They remember or reassemble a sweet, bountiful homeland in their imaginations. Almost every Greek I know living in Athens imagines an original idiaiteri patrida, particular homeland, in the arid, impoverished hills of Sparti or Thiva, while a handful of families that have been Athenian for generations yearn for the real Greece of 100 years ago. The Greeks of the diaspora chink glasses of whiskey and imported ouzo and remember Mother Greece, the sun-soaked land surrounded by the sparkling Aegean, Mediterranean, Adriatic, and Ionian seas. I was born into the Greek community of New York City and went to the parochial school of St. Nicholas Church. Greek lessons were daily, history on Tuesdays, religion on Fridays, language on the other days. Even though I'd been born right there in Queens, my mother in Brooklyn and her mother in Manhattan, I was taught that I did not come from New York, but from a place across the ocean. By second or third grade, I knew that my father's island was called Cyprus, and on it was a village that was my idiaiteri patrida, my particular homeland. The restaurant owners whose profits kept our St. Nicholas Day School open spent summers with their children, my classmates, in the Greek towns of their origin, where they swam in the morning, slept through sultry afternoons, and reveled in the breezy nights with music and good wine. Then they went back to America and told everyone that Greece was paradise, that they would live there if only they could. For the years I attended St. Nicholas, from pre-K until we left after I finished 4th grade, mine was the only hand that didn't rise when teachers asked who had been gone to Greece in the summer. My parents taught high school, my father history, my mother English, and even though they were the only parents with the summer off, they couldn't afford yearly trips to Greece. My parents raved about their years at St. Demetrius in New York. They raved about teaching kids who loved to learn about their heritage. The 1970s, have become a dreamy kind of Ithaca for my parents because never once in the decades of teaching they followed did they find students so eager to learn. It seems. In spite of the wonder of those years, my father asked my mother to promise, before they even married, that she would go to Cyprus with him when the time came. He didn't want to go back to his village exactly, but to a land even more his own, because he had dreamed of it privately ever since he was a child, and his Boy Scout troop camped in the pine-covered forests of the mountains. We will live in a place too beautiful to describe, he promised. There will never be any clouds in the sky. They were saving up for what my father, unlike all his family and friends, was determined against their advice to achieve: permanent return to his own island, Cyprus, his Ithaca. I went to college in Ithaca, not the Ionian Island, the city in upstate New York. The unending precipitation and relentless cloud cover, low, gray, and ugly, hid even that dull slate-colored strip of Cayuga Lake that on clear days served me for a glimpse of water to soothe the absence of my Mediterranean. All the Cornell Greeks used to gather on the weekends and complain. Besotted with a yearning for return at a place a little deeper than romance, the Greeks drank too much and danced together and complained about the absence of light and about this gray prison city Ithaca, its people so cheerful and its hills so low. We complained beautifully, ending the nights at 3 or 4 in the morning with notes of nostalgia on a guitar. The old songs, the rebetika of refugees from Asia Minor, brought together undergrads, grads, and professors who all desired their own beautiful Greece. Greece. The Greeks sang of the sea and of the moonlight, of their country's continuing fall from glory. Give the Greek an empty chair, a tumbler full of alcohol or air, and he will dance the Zeybekiko, the solitary dance of the Byzantine border lords. The group makes a circle around the man and he dances, tumbling into each step, tripping, bending, falling, rising just before he hits the floor. Around him in a circle, we clap and bend our necks, not in worship, but in love, and the dancer swings his leg, circles over a stranger's neck. In the summer of 2010, I had just been admitted to a 5-year graduate program that would be sending me to Greece each summer. I'll have the best of both worlds, I told my Cypriot friends and family, a salary from America and 3 months to come here and write on the beach. It's a compromise that leaves me where my father spent his life, on the edge of 2 worlds. Am I going to live on the outside of both worlds too? Live without a place where I belong? I have always loved the answer offered by these lyrics by Manolis Rasoulis in the song Αγελάδα. Η πιο γλυκιά πατρίδα είναι η καρδιά, Οδυσσέα γύρνα κοντά μου. The sweetest homeland is the heart. Odysseus, come back to me. That land is sacred. It is pain and joy. Every one of us is one who aches over a border. Καθένας είναι ένας που σύνορο πονά. And I am a no one who takes you for a stroll. Κι εγώ είμαι ένας κανένας που σας σεριανά. The heart may be the sweetest homeland, and Greece, as Rasoulis writes, may have taught us to breathe and die wherever we are. Να νασαίνω που πατώ, να πεθαίνω που βρεθώ. But the Cyprus of Caribs, Terabith, and Cyclamen yet pulls me. I feel that I know who I am through this yearning for the churning of seas, the light of the sun, the slope of a rock, the lift of a wave. I am a Greek who will always ache over a border. I love to run in the heat of an American day and watch sunlight sparkle over the water. That makes me ache even harder for Cyprus, where I cannot stay. While I run, sweat runs down my face as it does when I run in the sun-parched hills close to my home. I love to smell ocean, even in America. I always find water to run beside, to smell the salt and the dying fish as I remember mountains sloping into the sea. I live the new Greek poetry and the old, old stories. I live my myth and my story as I run by the shore of an Atlantic inlet that smells to me like the wide Mediterranean Sea. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving.
Thank you, Joanna.
It's an honor to be in a community that I know understands this experience at a somewhat more maybe personal level than my American readers.
Definitely. So fascinating. Αγελάδα, να ανασένω όπου πατώ. It's a beautiful song that inspired you so beautifully.
I wonder if anyone has any comments or questions at this stage. And
I do.
Catherine?
for it, Catherine.
Oh my goodness, I'm just, my beautiful. Did you, I'm trying to remember, did you do your PhD with Scott Cairns at the University?
Yes.
I think I
yes.
remembered seeing that come through the comments. You wrote that, when I read, and oh God, your writing, it's just so poetic, and the imagery, and it's just visual, and all my senses were enlivened, and just, but the the sensibility of, I was writing some things. I'm going to kind of go backwards through my notes here. Know who I am through yearning. Oh, that is just, I so understand that. And a Greek who will always ache over a border. Oh my goodness, I'm so moved. I think, did your piece say something like live without a place I don't belong? Is that?
Yeah, I used to, that was kind of I eventually was reconciled to the way I couldn't understand why in the US, everybody was like, oh, she's the Greek girl. She's different because she's Greek. And in Cyprus, I'm different because I'm the American.
Right.
And I was like, how can it be both? How can I be the Greek girl and the American girl? And I'm never one of them. I'm never included. And I eventually just came to terms with it. And partly through writing, like sometimes you just write that you're angry. I was like, this isn't fair. How can I be the Americana in Cyprus and the Greek girl who isn't like us because she's Greek in America? And I just came to terms with it. And I'm like, this is the space, this middle space. I'm always going to be the person who is considered the other thing. And the one of my two identities that is not like whoever I'm with.
Yeah. No, I just, that was profound. And I think each of us aches without a border. Oh, God, I mean, just some of the lines in the piece were, and then the whole description of the dance, which is, I forgot, give the Greek an empty vessel. Is that what you said? An empty
tumbler, because like, have you seen in the Zeybekiko, when they dance Zeybekiko, they take a glass and a glass, and sometimes it's empty, so it's full of air. Yeah,
it's full of air. And then, but I love tumbling. I mean, the language with that, it was a poem, tumbling into each step and bend our neck in love. Oh my God. Anyway, and then the whole, the piece just kept mentioning Ithaca, and I don't know, the sweet modern Greeks, the sweet, bountiful, I think, memory of homeland. Anyway, I was very moved by your piece. It's beautiful. I'm going to buy your book.
Thank you so much. It means a lot because it took me 15 years to write the book, like coming to these realizations, coming to figure out what belongs, what doesn't belong. It took a very long time. So it means a lot. Like every word that you said really means a lot, and makes me feel better that I labored over every sentence, every part, every clause. So thank you for saying that. I feel, and the community, this is the completion. We write by ourselves, but we do hope for readers who understand it. So what you said, Catherine, really means a lot. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad this worked into my time today. So.
Πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα παρουσίαση. Θα μιλήσω στα ελληνικά. Δεν μπορώ να μιλάω τόσο καλά αγγλικά. Χήμαρος από αυτό που κατάλαβα, με συγκίνησε και με ενθουσίασε. Θα ήθελα να μπορούσα να διαβάσω το βιβλίο. Είναι θέματα που μας αγγίζουν και μας απασχολούν όλους όσους ζήσαμε σε δύο πατρίδες, σε δύο χώρες. Ακούγοντας τη συγγραφέα, οι σκέψεις μου πήγαν στην παιδική μου ηλικία, οπότε ο πατέρας μου ήταν πρόσφυγας, 7 ετών ήρθε στην Ελλάδα με την οικογένειά του και μετά το 52, το 24, το 52 μετακομίσανε σε ένα άλλο χωριό για να μπορούν να έχουν γη για καλλιέργεια. Και πάντοτε εμείς μεγαλώσαμε ακούγοντας συμπατρίδα, την πατρίδα δηλαδή την πρώτη τους, και στο χωρίο Νεμουνέ, στο χωριό μας, που ήταν όχι αυτό που γεννήθηκα εγώ και μεγαλώσαμε, αλλά το χωριό που εγκαταστάθηκαν, το πρώτο χωριό. Και αυτό ήταν με αγάπη, με μεγάλη αγάπη και με λατρεία, αλλά και με κάποιο δυσκολία σε εμάς να ενταχθούμε ίσως σε εκείνη την κοινωνία. Η πιο γλυκιά πατρίδα είναι η καρδιά, με εκφράζει απόλυτα και μου φέρνει στη σκέψη μου το δικό μου το βιβλίο «Ο τόπος μέσα μας», που ασχολείται με την διασπορά και με την ξενότητα και με τον ξοριζωμό και με την προσφυγιά, και νομίζω ότι είναι κάτι, υπάρχει κοινό στο «Ο τόπος μέσα μου», η πιο όμορφη πατρίδα είναι η καρδιά, γιατί πολλές φορές ωρεοποιούμε αυτό που αφήσαμε λόγω της νοσταλγίας. Σε ένα διήγημά μου, λίγο θέλω 2 λεπτά να το πω αυτό, ένας ήρωας που είναι πραγματικό πρόσωπο και ζει στην Αυστραλία, που πήγε εκεί παιδί και γέννησε εκεί τα παιδιά του, έκανε την οικογένειά του, έρχεται στο χωριό του και λέει να βγούμε να σας δείξω τον τόπο μου, και αναρωτιέται μήπως έπρεπε να πω στον τόπο μας, μήπως έπρεπε να πω ο τόπος μου, και μετά αναρωτιέται είναι ο τόπος μου. Τι θέλω να πω, ότι τελικά ο τόπος είναι μέσα μας, είναι αυτή η καρδιά που μιλάει ο Ρασούλης, και είμαστε εμείς μια άλλη, έχουμε ανάλογα με τα βιώματά μας δηλαδή, έχουμε 2 πατρίδες, έχουμε πολλές πατρίδες κάποιοι άλλοι από εμάς. Ό,τι ζούμε και όπου ζούμε καταγράφεται μέσα μας και το φέρουμε μέσα μας και πατάμε δηλαδή σε μια χώρα, σε έναν τόπο, και φέρνοντας τον άλλο τόπο στην καρδιά, για να βρούμε μια ισορροπία. Αυτά.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Χαίρομαι που σας εκφράζει, και this is what we are looking for, to find the connections between our experience and they feel real. Sometimes when I go to Azgatado, my father's village, and people tell me, they tell me like, this is your village. It feels good. It feels good for other people to tell me you belong here.
Vassiliki, I wonder if you could summarize a bit of what Despina said.
I would definitely say a few things. Despina tried to make a connection between what Joanna said about the space, the place is our own heart. And Despina has also written a book that is called The Place Within Us, which is that referring to that heart. So she felt connected. This work of Joanna's speaks directly to her and to all of us. So for you who don't understand Greek, just this is the gist of what Despina said to Joanna. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Despina, I was saying that this particularly resonates for those of us who have experienced more than one homeland, in a sense, more than one country, and the feel that we've discussed in previous episodes of our series, the notion of at times feeling like a stranger in a strange land, and trying to find the sense of belonging. And sometimes it's belonging in between 2 places.
Hi, thank you for reading so beautifully, Joanna. It's always a pleasure listening to you read. The way you read your work is always very sort of affect-inducing. I had a question about these borders because it's such an interesting way for those of us indeed who live between spaces and places. And I know that, at least in my reading, your book understands a lot of the body, what a body is, how it's legible, how can you read me as the person in the village, right? Or the person being raised in New York. And I was wondering what these borders do in terms of dressing and undressing us, right? And I'm thinking in particular the ways in which our sexualities work within those spaces and the places and the ways in which those garments that we're forced to wear, this idea of the border that's in pain, that causes pain, that inflicts pain, is actually a border, like a magic fantasy door that forces us to remove parts of ourselves by force because someone else has decided those borders. I know we've discussed about this before, but I was wondering if you would have anything to say about that sort of transition from who I am here, who I'm allowed to be here, how I'm read here, whatever this here is, and then the other part, the border, because I don't want to assume a Cyprus US or US Cyprus, whatever that way means, right? That wall, that border. What is it forcing you to undress? What would you say about that?
I thought that I was writing two separate books. I thought that I was writing a book about being Greek American and a separate book about coming out as a lesbian. And I put them together. I had about 100 pages of each, and I put them together so that I could get my PhD on time. And I opened my dissertation defense with an apology. I said, I'm sorry, this is obviously two halves of one book. And I'm sorry, I just put them together because otherwise, if I wrote both of them, I would take 10 years to graduate. And they said, are you kidding? The most interesting thing in this manuscript is the way you're writing about sexuality informs and intersects with your writing about ethnic identity. I was like, really? I didn't know that. So from that moment until I was informed by my dissertation committee in the defense that one is serving as a metaphor for another. And as you were asking your question, I realized how much what I just said about coming to terms with always being told I'm not part of the community serves as a metaphor, even as it was sort of a realization and a coming to terms that I had to do maybe first, almost like all of my working through my discomfort with being told you're the Americana or you're the Greek. That was something that I did before I reckoned with sexuality. And that was like sort of a practice for reckoning with how I'm always going to be told and being reconciled to the way I'm always going to be told this is what you are. And as a lesbian who presents as very feminine and as I'm constantly told, but you don't look like a lesbian. And men are constantly telling me, I'm attracted to you, therefore, therefore you should be attracted to me. And it's impossible for me. I've tried many times to make these usually Greek straight men fathom that I am not attracted to men. I'm attracted to women just like they are. And this it's like an insistence. It's a, you are αυτό που βγάζεις. They'll be like, δεν καταλαβαίνεις αυτό που βγάζεις. And I'm like, that's not actually coming from me. That's you projecting your desire onto me. So absolutely, the way in which I'm always being told by others to what extent I belong or don't belong, and my identity, my ethnic identity is a metaphor and is a dialectic with how I'm always being told what others perceive my sexuality to be, and I can manipulate it. And so knowing that allows me just to recognize it and maybe be a little playful with how, you know, people will say, like, talk about dress sounds like, oh, and I explain like, oh, I don't express myself through clothes. I just want people to give me compliments. I say things like that, messing with, because people make assumptions about me and my desire based on how I look. And I've learned through manipulating people's perception of my ethnicity, I've also learned to feel a little bit more empowered than I used to about what people are assuming about my desire and sexuality. And so I learned, I used to like really try to be perceived as Greek, and fakailosamu. I have an accent. So therefore I was never going to win. So now whenever a Greek person asks me where I'm from, I say I'm from New York. That's it. And they're like, but your Greek is really good. I was like, I don't know. You asked me where I'm from New York. And they're like, wow, your Greek is really good for being from New York. And then when they find out I lived in Cyprus for 11 years, they retract the compliment. It was like, no, actually, your Greek isn't good for living in 11 years. But there's this continuous demand that I match what I say about my desire, my self-perception matches what they have already assumed about me. So just repeating, yes, my negotiation of what is assumed about me and about my ethnic identity was like a trial run for negotiating sexuality. I realized when my professors told me that the two halves of a book about Greek identity and a book about sexuality belong together, I realized that what connects them is desire. And so this longing for a homeland, for a place to belong. And like Vespina was saying, we want the land that we feel our ancestors were from. That longing is very similar to the longing for a person to connect with and the desire for to be completed by another person. And so thinking about how those two are similar and different is a deep part of the book. So thanks again for everybody's questions.
So it's so nice to hear, Joanna, such a poetic prose. It's full of cadence, it's full of beauty. As a poet, I really enjoyed her reading. So my simple question is, there are two things that are always associated with this kind of, let's say, diaspora writing. One, the psychic level of expressions and the narrations, and another is the physical level of expression. So how you balance these two, let's say, levels so that you can project your story and your, let's say, thoughts or your emotions in a balanced way. So may I wonder how you balance these two kind of things? Because in most of the cases, a writer writes about a kind of, let's say, these diaspora sense of writing. So there are some sort of, let's say, dislocations and interlocations of the things. So I wonder how you balance just this.
Thank you so much for the question. It's very difficult, especially when there's a lot of information that an American audience needs to know to make sense of this. For example, the history. I also have a grandfather who was born, his family was from what's now Albania, and then they went to what's now Istanbul, and then they went to Greece, and then to America. And I want to put in this history as well as the reflections and the emotions, but the readers get bored when they hear too much thinking and exposition. So it's in the revision. And I was very insulted. People read drafts and they're like, it was really hard to get through all the history and politics and all the reflection. And I was hurt, but I did have to, what the response of today's audience shows is that what was successful is that in revision, I tried to spread it out. I put little pieces of information and then get more into the visual and use as much physical images in order to convey the emotion. And exactly, the balance comes in the revision and the rewriting. It's a good reminder that for me, when I'm writing new things and I'm very frustrated that it's not good in the first draft, no one loves the first draft, I have to remove a lot of the things that I need to write down. I need to write down the thinking in order to know what it is I want to imply. It's funny, some people read it and they'd say, oh, you said that blah, 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 blah. And I've published once in a journal where the editor was like, I think here, he put a text and he's like, I think you mean to say blah, blah, blah. I was like, yeah. I'm like, you got it. It's implied. So this kind of writing demands a lot of implication with the physical, using the physical images. And I circle things and I say, imply this. And that's how I find the balance. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I'm really satisfied. Okay, thank you.
Joanna, I was struck by what you were saying earlier about the two halves of the book starting out as two separate things and somehow they became unified. And it's a metaphor for the integration that you've experienced in your own life. But it's also, it exemplifies how we so often are cut off in our identities, our ethnic identity, our sexual identity. And it's a tricky thing to bring them all together and come to a cohesive whole in our lives. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And having good readers to read the manuscript and give me this insight was really helpful. So I owe a lot to the people and everyone who teaches. It's a burden for the teacher. The teachers have to really think about and feel what their students are writing and offer them these insights.
Joanna, where is the book available?
Yeah, it's available most bookstores. Actually, it's on bookshop.org, and most bookstores. I put a few links on this page. I put in the chat. I have a page on my, thank you, Peter. I have a page on my website where I have links to a few bookstores that I think will, if you prefer, obviously Amazon has it, and then also, and Nicola got it in Cyprus somehow, so it can be found through maybe, I don't know exactly, but maybe Amazon UK. And then there's a few independent bookstores that through which you can order it. So whichever works for you. Thank you for asking, Catherine.
I was struck by use topic Ροψωμί της ξενιτιάς. I wonder if you have read or delved into the τραγούδια της ξενιτιάς at all, or it's just the songs like Manolis Rasoulis' songs that use similar patterns.
I haven't done any research. I've just lived them and just really enjoy. And I love something that I want to write about more in my second book is the way the culture in Greece of singing really profound lyrics. I know like America has Bob Dylan and some good, poets who also sing. But I think that there's an especially profound, there's real poetry in these songs that regular people who haven't gone to college, just sing on a regular basis. We'll be sitting around a table and they'll just belt out these extremely profound lyrics. So that is what I found, like, that's one of the reasons I feel so drawn to Greek culture and want us to spend as much time as possible, because I love how the high culture and low culture feel a little more merged there. That I don't feel like I'm elitist for loving beautiful lines, because I feel like regular people have an appreciation for beautiful poetry in a way that in America that's much more divided. Loving high art is kind of an elite thing. And so I love like sort of feeling like I'm one of the people, and while also appreciating beautiful poetry. One of the best songwriters of Greece, contemporary Greece, along with Manolis Rasoulis, is named Manolis Eleftheriou. So because we have the same last name, no relation, but one of my dreams is I'm not sure all of his poems have been translated into English. So it's like kind of, I want to translate his poems because we have the same last name. And he's amazing. Rasoulis Eleftheriou and Eleftheris Papadopoulos are some of the great I just love how songs are poems. in Greek culture.
Yeah, I noticed how really attached to the lyrics of those songs you are. And I think you use them also for your teaching, right?
Well, and like I love how there's a lot of mourning and there's grieving. I used to, when I was a teenager, I didn't like Stelios Kazantzidis, who sings "To pikro psomitis xenitias ine pikro," the bread of the foreign land is bitter. But then when I grew up, I was like, oh yeah, there's a good reason to be kind of sad and crying and mourning, and it's I think it's healthy. That's why I said when I was describing how the Greeks at Cornell were complaining that the Americans were too cheerful. I think that there's a kind of this in America, pressure to be positive. I think it's unhealthy. Generally, I want to be respectful of different cultures on the one hand, but we also share human nature and psychology. And I think the way so much Greek music complains and laments, I find it very cathartic. And I think it's healthy to just be crying together. And I think tragedy was a way of, like, the catharsis of tragedy is in the songs, and that we can lament together how difficult life is and talk together about how life is very unfair. And, it's not just the best. Good people don't win or succeed the way in American culture, there's an expectation, right? That the people who are good things happen to them, and poor people must be poor because they weren't working hard enough. This is very toxic, I think. And how can you really be positive and optimistic if everybody who's suffering, it's like their fault? Whereas I love the way the Greek songs, they complain that all the good people are suffering, all the good people are hurting, and they have endured injustice. I find that I'm like, yes, me too. I'm also suffering and I've endured injustice. And I love that about the songs. And I want to sort of find a way to bring more of that to American readers. Thank you.
Yeah, and Joanna, you reminded me that you studied at Cornell. Have you worked with Gail, since you mentioned the cathartic effect of lament that goes from ancient Greek tragedy to today in the popular Greek culture?
I was an extremely fortunate little 18-year-old who did an independent study with Gail Holst-Warhoft.
Wow.
And she was an adjunct professor there, so she didn't even ask for any compensation. I feel extremely indebted to that. And I was planning to major in physics. And she said to me, I think, so there were two of us. I'm actually in touch on Facebook with the other girl we did some Greek literature and translation, and we did a couple of translations, and we wrote papers on the literature. And she said to me, you understand literature. The other girl, not so much, but you understand. I'm not telling you to abandon physics, but you understand literature. And that kind of gave me the courage to be honest with myself about what I really, really, really wanted to do, which is literature.
For those of you who don't know Gail Holst, she's not only a writer and translator, but also a musician. And she's written on Rebetika, and she was a musician with Mikis Theodorakis and his band that circulated while Theodorakis himself was imprisoned. So she has a very interesting and complex profile, and what a privilege to have been able to know her and to study with her.
And everyone noticed the poetic nature of your prose, Joanna. You said that you also have written some poems, right?
Yeah, I've found that, as I mentioned, the missing persons of Cyprus really captured my imagination, even though I have no relatives who are refugees or obviously have any missing persons in the family. The idea that you could lose somebody and not know if they're alive or dead really haunted me. And my poems and some very, very short stories have focused on that, because I don't really have a lot to say about that. I just want to just deliver the facts themselves are so haunting and stark that I've they've written some poems that just offer this to the world. And I want to work on some more, maybe do a little collection of poems. You know, the invasion happened in 1974, and they've, you know, with DNA, the DNA, recognition, they've been able to identify the remains and find out. And unfortunately, what I've learned is, you know, the Greek Cypriot government was blaming the Turks, I Turci, for, you know, taking them hostages and not disclosing where they were. But some of the people were killed in friendly fire by Greek Cypriots. You know, it was an accident. They were killed, you know, Greeks killed Greeks, and the government wanted to cover this up. So they didn't identify them, and they had them buried, and they've identified. And there were these women were sure that their husbands were in the free part of Cyprus, and they went and they illegally, they dug up in a mass grave. They started digging and they were arrested, but then the government was forced to go ahead and identify the bones, since the women, they found their husbands buried in mass graves. And then because there was DNA processing, they were able to identify, and these women, they called them the Penelopes, and because they were waiting for 40 years for their husbands to come home. So this is so clearly, you know, really captivating. And I don't want to write about this as an essay. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to put the facts into poems and let them kind of speak for themselves.
Joanna, first, I would like to really express my appreciation for the kind of work that you are doing that is useful and of course, members also of this group, because it creates material that we need in our teaching, and also to create spaces for literary appreciation and making it ideological interventions also within Greek America. So thank you. I have a question about your recent turn towards writing a scholarship. And I would be very much interested in hearing your thoughts, your perspective about this shift, if you consider it a shift, from literary narratives, from literary engagements to a kind of more kind of scholarly modality of thinking. Does this entail a different kind of part of your brain? Are you turning off and turning on different kinds of switches? What is going on then in this transition that you are experiencing from the literary to the scholarly? Although I don't want to make this duality very, very rigid, because the scholarly can have literary dimensions, and the literary also, as you have been practicing it, also incorporates scholarly dimensions.
Yes, you described my work very, very well. Well, my first response when I finished the 25 pages of an article on Greek American women educators in New York City, I was like, I didn't have to cut my veins. I was like, I'm not bleeding, I'm not crying. It was very strange. I was like, did I really write? Because I engaged my intellect, but to write scholarship, I didn't have to you know, what I have to do when I'm doing creative work is really confront things that are really uncomfortable for me. It's only interesting to the reader if I force myself to face something really difficult about the world, really, right? Like something like, and just the emotion that you have to experience in order to write the poetic prose. You have to be in a certain emotional space. And it's very frustrating because it's so hard. I'm really grateful for the compliments, but it's also scary because I can't just do that. I have to be in a certain emotional, deeply sort of, you know, I understand why some people take drugs to write. I don't, but sometimes I want to, because it's hard to get into this space of emotion that produces the more poetic prose. And, you know, I just have to write. I was like, this is it's easy in an emotional way, and I don't have to make sure every single word is exactly in the right spot. I don't mean to undermine. I can use my brain, and it was sort of relaxing. I enjoyed it. I mean, it hasn't been published yet, so I don't know. It's going to take a lot of revision. So there is something really different about using the intellect. It's not a turn in the sense that I've written before, right? I've done, you know, a PhD, which required a lot of other kind of writing. So I hope to continue to, and I've written scholarship on nonfiction. So I really want to be able to be both, just like, I mean, look at my name, Joanna, Greece and Cyprus. I just don't choose between one or the other. So I hope, I would like ideally to be able to write criticism and creative work. I told a professor once during my master's that in one semester I was good in criticism, and then another semester I was good in creative, and it was like each semester I was good at one or the other. I couldn't combine them. And he said it would get easier, and I didn't believe him. I was like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And then one day I realized I had written something creative and something critical in the same day, and it wasn't hard to switch. And I was like, oh, okay. I got used to it. You develop the skills. So they're different, different skills, different abilities. Like I was talking about the implication, the way a creative work has to embed so much off the page, you know, that's not on the page. And in critical work, you know, you state what you state. You're not trying to imply very much. So it's different and very, very rewarding and mutually informative. And I think it's a privilege to be able to do both and to be supported. Also, like some institutions won't count work in one or the other because I was hired as a creative writer, and maybe in a more rigid institution, I wouldn't be allowed to count scholarship, but in my institution, they're much more flexible. And so those institutional problems are also worth noting, that in order to write, we need time and we need to be supported. And, you know, historically only nobles and rich people could write. Now I have a job that gives me this time to do it, and not everybody has that.
And George, I also think that you do the opposite. You shift from the scholarly to the creative lately. Am I right?
Yes, I have been trying to create a space of fluidity where I can cross boundaries. But yeah, it's yeah. I mean, I'm very much vested, and I should say, emotion. I hear Joanna, what you're saying. You know, when you speak about issues that are personally so important that your emotions are invested in high intensities. But also have experienced this when I do scholarship, and in many ways, anger is really a driving force in my scholarship, and I do invest a lot of emotion in that. So, but I will leave it here. But yeah. So yeah, thank you though. Yeah.
Joanna, I'm curious, do you have any poems at hand that you might want to share with us? Anything that's accessible?
I can pull up A Privileged Glimpse of the Dead, which I just described.
I would love that.
I was struck with you wanted to study physics, Joanna.
Mm-hmm.
But some of what physics encompasses is coming through your poetic prose. I have a wonderful chapter on moonlight, right?
On what?
The chapter with the moon.
Yeah. That's my favorite thing that I've been. I think Mimi Lesas was a chemist, and he gave me a way to explain interest in both science and art, literature. He said art and science are both seeking the truth, just in different ways. All right, I found the poem if you'd like to hear it. I have a few versions, so it took a second to find the revised version on the computer. So it's called A Privileged Glimpse of the Dead, also taken from a newspaper, an official who said those words. The guns, Turkish, Greek, went quiet in Cyprus. Men went home. Androula Palma slept alone. Her husband, a ghost, her island torn asunder. Wait for him, the government said. The Turks, they took him to sweat in their salt mines. Wait. Androula knew in 1974, after the war, that the man was dead. For 20-odd years, Androula drove up to the UN men in baby blue helmets, down to the suntanned Greek Cypriot villagers, up to the suntanned Turkish Cypriot guards, asking for word of her ghost. At 5 one morning in August 1998, with a fellow Penelope riding shotgun, Androula shouldered an axe. A shovel snuck into the warrior's cemetery and began to hack at one nameless grave after the next. Soon, the women's axes struck bone. Policemen stopped the Penelopes mid-grave robbery. At the jail, policemen questioned, then set the women free. Front page stories of black-clad Penelopes clawing at clavicles, belt buckles, rib cages, bootlaces, and stones drove the political men to act. They hired an American forensic anthropologist. With DNA, he exposes what the government hid. He confirms that the husbands slain and left here in their own city have lain unnamed for 25 years. It was not, after all, the Turks or their salt mines ravenous for men. How much blame have we Greeks heaped like so much rotting flesh on our old enemy? Greek Cypriot political men sealed the dirty secret under dirt. How many women must undo the lawless burials of men? The American and forensic anthropologist will deliver the bones, state the unflattering facts, death by friendly fire, and offer his words. A privileged glimpse of the dead, but not before he laments, some exhumations took place in the past by persons who were not professionals. This, he'll complain, has created complications. Widows now, and Penelopes no longer, the women will sing at last a funeral rite. Ghosts will rest. When an interviewer asks about closure for the documentary Antigone's speech, Androula Palma will proclaim, they've pulled out the knife. Now I have only my wound.
Was this the final version, or
Final.
would you like to share the previous
Sure.
one too? We want
If you,
to
the
see where you...
is better, tell me. It's shorter.
It's, yeah, and so many questions arise from this poem too. Would you consider yourself an activist or simply
Okay,
seeking
a
the
privileged
truth?
glimpse of the dead. I'm excited because it's like workshop. I've submitted the new one publication, but it's not too late. If the old version is better, I'll change it. A privileged glimpse of the dead. After the war, Androula waited for her husband to return. After 19 years, the government pronounced him dead. The government said the Turks took the bodies back to Turkey. There were no funerals. To believe it is so, I want to see the bones. After the official report came, Androula waited 6 more years. Then she called a friend and the 2 women started to dig. 2 women, 2 pickaxes, and either instinct or luck. After 6 hours of digging, the women's axes struck bone. TV reporters ran to the spot. Androula told the cameras, I will never forget those limbs dropping off in my hands. She owed her children a piece of their father, she said, and then, if bones could speak, their story would send shivers down the spines of those who live. The reporters edited the tape. The women's find might compromise the government. DNA testing developed. The Physicians for Human Rights arrived after work in Bosnia. Forensic anthropologists collected saliva, hair, and fingernails. DNA samples from the living. Professor William Haglund said the relatives would be brought to see the remains. They were not to get their hopes up, for the science was new. Not every body could be named. Nevertheless, stated William Haglund of the Physicians for Human Rights, after 25 years, it will be a privileged glimpse of the dead. For the bodies that were named at last, the state held funerals. For their mothers and wives, there was anguish and then peace. For the names that matched no bones, there were no funerals. Their wives, mothers, and children are waiting, each with a photograph hung from her neck, the photograph resting on the spot that marks her heart. I just realized there may be very different poems. Maybe I have 2 poems. Can tweak it a little. This was very productive. Thank you.
Yeah.
I revised it so much, it's totally different. I just realized that.
Quite different. The first one reads much more like a journalistic narrative. The second one is much more evocative and on an effective level.
Some details from the first version, the last one that you read, Joanna, could have been entered in the first one that you read, which for me was more effective, the first one, because it was more evocative for me. And the other was more prosaic.
Yeah, I think I heightened but Peter just said the opposite.
Yeah, different.
So the one that I found more evocative was the first one you read, the more final version. That's the one that had the greater emotional impact.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I did improve it. But yeah, there's some details in the original that I can turn into this was very helpful. And my plan was to get a few more poems published before I put my papers for tenure, September 2023. So I was like, I want to get a couple more things out. So this is really helpful. Thank you.
For instance, the line, saliva, hair, fingernails. I think that is missing from. I feel like it could have room for that. And I don't know what the others think, but it was very powerful.
I just wanted to say that, well, first I was there in 1974. So I was evacuated by the RAF because the Americans wouldn't recognize us. That's a long story. But I do want to say that the second poem, when you say that the women went with 2 axes and to this, it brought feelings up because it was, 2 together, the women together, and the double imagery of the axis in particular, because it's such a brutal kind of an instrument. And that's all I have to say.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Which is also giving reference to the dichotomy of Cyprus, the division, this double X.
And that's how, this is, you can all see, though, it connects to the question about, Vassiliki was asking me about, do you write poems? I'm like, and you can see why this wouldn't really fit in an essay, especially I feel like it's not my story. And there's just nothing to say other than the facts. They speak so much for the brutality of the axes and what they were required to do in order just to bring to light that their husbands were right there. The ironies and the irony and the sadness is just so enormous that I think that poems are the best way and my only way to talk about this. An essay in prose would, from my perspective, dilute the enormity of this. And maybe in the future, I will want to, add more prose, but I really want to get a little bit of maybe a chapbook, a collection of poems about this. So thank you for asking, and thank you for encouraging me to work on this.
It's so powerful, so moving, just incredible.
Joanna, you mentioned in your book, you speak quite a bit about your foray into the occupied territory. I'm just curious to hear more about your account of that, your experience of that.
In 2002, the checkpoints opened and Greeks were permitted to go across the border, and I didn't plan to, but my friend who was visiting, a British friend, was like, oh, let's go. So I did, and it was so surreal. It was so bizarre because I wasn't really expecting everything to be in Turkish. It was, why would I not know that? But I had heard about Gerinya, Amokostos, Morfu, all these places. I had been hearing about them in Greek for for a decade, from almost my whole life. And so I was like, I'm gonna go across and see these Greek places. And the irony is that it shouldn't have been shocking that everything was in Turkish, because that's the whole point, was it was occupied by Turkey. But that was a shock to find that it was not a place that I could even function in because everything was in Turkish. And so it was very, very surreal. And I had to ask a friend, the friend that I went with, I had to ask her, I was like, did we never talk to anybody? And she's like, yeah, you felt like it was such an emotional, it was so emotional just to make the decision to go, and like possibly immoral, and still even to this day, a lot of Cypriots feel like it's a betrayal to go and visit a place that they feel should be part of their country. So she said it was such a big deal and such even a moral risk to go to the occupied side of Cyprus that talking to a Turkish Cypriot would be too much. It was just so difficult. Thank you, Catherine. I really, that means a lot, coming to one excellent poet like yourself. It's very encouraging and so great. And thank you again to Pete. I didn't know Catherine's work. So thank you to Peter and Vassiliki for offering this forum where writers can meet.
It's just truly a heart honor to listen to you, and everything you've read and shared today, your profound knowledge of the boundary. And I love the discussion on sexuality and diaspora. It's just really important discussion, conversation. Yeah. But I must go, and deep appreciation.
Thank you so much for coming and for your words.
Joanna, I really want to go back to the two versions of your poem. I want to know, what was the process of finalizing the second version? What did you took away? I mean, I'm very interested in the process.
I just moved things, little by little, you just tinkering.
Was there something
take
that
things
was
out.
bothering you, and what was the criteria that you used? Just feeling
just trying listen. I think it's less intellectual. You're listening to how it sounds, and yeah, that's it. And you can see how I'm not sure. I was like, maybe the original is better, so I'm glad everybody thinks the new one is better. But like there's things that maybe in the old, so it's just a process of listening and feeling, and so the sound of the poems, and there's a lot of like noticed as I was reading, there's a lot of internal rhyme, and it doesn't rhyme, there's not rhyming on the exterior, it's not in form, and it's not rhyming on the outside, but I use internal rhyme even in my prose a lot. I really like rhyme or assonance, really the same vowel. I really like having and emphasizing. So I have like slain and lane, like the bones had lain there, and then it connects with slain. So you make connections through things that sound similar. So you're kind of moving things around in the poem and rephrasing things to generate that feeling. And you're manipulating tension a lot, but in any kind of creative writing, you want to manipulate tension in the sense that you're heightening tension, but you have to leave the tension. It's a lot like music, right? Things heighten and then they relax. And some of those, the enjambment, which is when you stop in the middle of a sentence and you cause. So what poetry does that prose doesn't really do is it creates a tension, a pull between the natural syntax, the grammar of the sentence, and where you pause when you are writing, in prose, where you pause where there's a comma or a semicolon or a period. And then the line break forces you to pause at a moment when you wouldn't normally pause if it were prose, and that creates a certain tension. And then the emotions themselves, the words, they also create tension. So it's really similar to, it's strange to describe the process like without teaching. Like usually I describe things when I'm teaching. And this is fun to try and describe like what it really feels like. So it feels like you're listening for how the tension will be built up and relaxed, and you're generating meaning and making sure the reader is picking up on basically those big ironies. The huge ironies in this situation is that the government blamed the Turks when they were trying to keep a secret. And then a bigger irony is, it's wrong, obviously, to lie about something like this, but all nations tell these kinds of lies because we need to believe in our nation. How do you make people feel like they're a part of a group? Often, you say that the group is good and all the other guys are bad. And this is something we're obviously working against it and subverting this kind of nationalistic point of view, but I'm also maybe asking the reader to remember that we can't not have groups. So how do you ethically form a group? Obviously lying, I'm repeating myself now, but lying isn't the answer, but the complexity and the paradoxes of just human life and needing to belong to something, I'm asking the reader to confront the way violence is part of life. Even a moment that was, peaceful and a moment of reconciliation required this kind of violence, the way they were arrested for this.
It's like the process of translation, Peter, right?
Yes.
Which also this point of yours about the violence reminded me the use of the myth of Antigone in your final version, which is so powerful. I think it's really one of the most powerful moments in your poem.
And that's something that I just didn't know about the documentary. When I decided to revise it, because I was asked to contribute a poem by a volume. Oh, that's another factor. I was asked, I didn't actually submit this for publication. I didn't think it was ready, and I didn't do any, but I didn't work on it. And then someone is publishing an anthology of poems about specific cities. And this is the one that I had that I wanted to work on. So I was like, So I think the fact that it was going to be in a book about cities, caused me to write about the bones were there in their city. So I emphasized that because it was for the volume. And that documentary, I just didn't know about it, or it hadn't been made. When I wrote the first draft, the documentary didn't exist. So these are things like that, things happen, real things happen when between drafts that you can add.
Thank you,
and just like the DNA, when I first went to Cyprus, the DNA didn't exist. So even when I first started, I first started writing about, I guess it was 2000 when I first wrote about Cyprus when I was an undergrad, my first creative writing class. And they weren't doing DNA processing then, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, certainly to me, the euphony and the rhythm of the final version are very different from the first. The first to me is much more linear, much more recounting of fact. The final version, as I said earlier, is much more evocative, but with a lot more implicit meaning. And I think that is really, it creates breadth and depth in the poetry, and that's what makes it really good poetry, is that element of the implicit meaning, but also the euphony that comes with it.
And I think there's about 12 years. I didn't do a lot of work between, but there are about 12 years. I think I wrote the first one in 2009 or 2010, and then I revised it last year. So I matured, I guess.
Very much. No, it really shows a big stylistic progression on your part. There was a piece in your book that delighted me, and I mean, many things did, but that also surprised me. You're talking about Melina Mercouri. I was so surprised to see Melina in the book, and she's a figure that I've always loved. And I'm just curious as to how that came into your consciousness and made its way into your narrative.
Yeah, that's another example of home. I was telling, I did a workshop last night at the place where I did my master's, and I was telling the kids, I was like, people are sometimes, I know you're not going to be, but sometimes people are disappointed. They expect some grand inspiration, and they're like, what inspired you to write this? I'm like, it was homework. But I tell them because I want them to remember that this thing that they're like, oh my God, it's so deep. I feel it so deeply. It must be, you know, divine inspiration. I'm like, no, this was my homework. So I took a creative writing class that was focused on portraiture and biography. And I was like, who am I going to write about? Who is really sticking out in my memory? That's really fascinating. And she was the first person that came to me. And I realized through writing that why I was so fascinated by her. And then actually another interesting sort of process aspect is I finalized the version of the essay and I was quite happy with it. And then after, and I didn't send it out for publication because I wanted about half of the book to be unpublished and half of the book, that's about the maximum you should have published in a literary work. They want some to be published, to prove that it's worthy, but I wanted half to be new, so I didn't send it out for publication. But it was complete. But then when I decided the order of the essays, I realized that it was going to be this essay, because it takes the essays are organized basically chronologically. There's kind of a recursive chronology going through the essays, and because I have the line where I realized that Melina was hot. And that's when I say, like, I didn't realize it at the time, but what I was feeling was Melina was hot. So that was going to be the first intimation. I was 15 years old when she passed away, and I found out about her because the media started talking about her so much. And I said, well, I want the first time sexuality is mentioned to also be paired with an understanding of my religious ardor and desire. And I want readers to recognize and kind of put those two in connection and realize how important that religion was to me, so that they can understand the struggle I had with sexuality. Because a lot of readers, you know, contemporary readers, are like, I don't understand, what's the big deal? They like, it's normal to be gay. Why are you so stressed about it? So, and it's a good thing that if that continues to happen. So I wanted to make sure they paired in their mind my desire for God and desire for connection with God and the divine and the transcendence that God provides with desire for women. And so the parts that are religious in the Melina Mercouri essay are because of its placement in the book. I was hoping that you would find that interesting because the placement in the book influenced the ultimate shape of the essay.
Yeah, thank you. We have just a few more minutes. I'm wondering if there are any closing comments or questions before we begin to wind down.
I don't have a closing comment. I have a follow-up comment on Joanna's engagement with Melina Mercouri, but you know, I can leave without asking.
We have time.
No, please go ahead.
Joanna, I would like to kind of probe the way you felt, you perceived Melina, and I will be going back to our previous conversation when we spoke about our academic selves and our literary and personal selves that we engage emotionally. So in many ways, then you're raising the issue about how we perceive, the audiences, and from our different positions, right? How we perceive a cultural icon such as Melina, and indeed Melina is hot in many different ways. But and I can, you know, I do have in mind, engraved the moment when she dances with a male friends kind of performing a Greek bravado in front of Homer, right? In a sense, you have here a sense of Greek identity. So on the one hand, yes, I do feel also this sense of seductiveness, but at the same time, my cultural studies self comes and nags me and says, don't be way too kind of excited about her, no pun intended here, because in many ways, Melina is also a product of a privileged background. She was marketed in a particular way. She was a beautiful woman. So here then we have, on the one hand, we have sexuality and also normative values of beauty and class issues coming together to produce this icon. And this kind of thinking leads me to be ambivalent about Melina.
That's the point I make in the essay, though, Yorgo.
Sorry?
That's the point that I make in the essay. And I argue that she embraces compromise, like she is a compromised icon. And so she's teaching me to avoid perfection. I know she's not, so I argue that I know she's not politically correct. And I know all these things. And I think she knew it as well. I think she was aware of the commercialism and the capitulation to market forces and nationalism. And what I come up with is it's a good thing to, I consider her an example, not only a role model, also of bravado and femininity, and the way she says, what she says about her work as a prostitute, that I only go with the men that I like. Like that's a major, she demands agency even when she's being paid for sex. So the demand for agency and also the insistence. So I consider her a model in that she's not politically correct and she's not, that she's compromised and commercialized. So I'm saying in it that there is no perfection, and that's what I think our view of her is actually quite well aligned. I don't think that the essay is an apotheosis or an ideology. Like I don't idealize her.
I did not say that. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I'm saying also, like, when we're attracted and infatuated with somebody, we can idealize and know that we're idealizing and know that they're not perfect, but still like really delight in, it's like, Peter talks about the delight in the icon, even as you know that there's something problematic about the movies.
Melina is a Greek delight, Lukumi.
Thank you all for being here today. Joanna, thank you so much for sharing your work and yourself with us. And this has just been a delightful conversation. Before we close, I want to mention that Vassiliki has been named Poet of the Week by the Voice of Greece.
Oh, thank you.
She is going to be featured twice a day, all of next week on the Voice of Greece, and you can find a link and the details on her Facebook page. So please check that out. She was interviewed by a journalist, two different journalists actually over the summer, and just lovely interviews about her work and her poetry and citizen tales and all that we're doing here. So congratulations for that. Our next speaker in the series, Vassiliki,
is Aristea Papalexandrou on November 22nd, same time. And later in January, we're going to have Yorgos Anagnostou, who is with us. And Aristea also is here. I want to congratulate you, Joanna and Peter. Thank you for coordinating this event. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want also to mention that this will be posted on our YouTube channel as a video. And later on, we're going to have with Peter a podcast featuring Joanna Eleftheriou with material from today's presentation. Once again, thank you so much. Joanna,
thank you all for being
so
here.
much for you all.
and
Deeply appreciate
tiny
it.
closing word, Vassiliki's collection Οι λεπτές δε τη lady, which we were translating as bathed in moonlight, in an augmented version in relation to the Greek original that was published last year by Melanie in Athens. We're hoping to have it in print in English in the augmented version by the beginning of next year. And so stay tuned for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.